Have you ever felt that peculiar sensation when meeting someone for the first time, yet experiencing a familiarity beyond explanation? That inexplicable connection that transcends the ordinary boundaries of consciousness? I have spent decades observing this phenomenon, and what I have discovered about the collision of conscious minds will transform how you understand your spiritual journey forever. Many of you have pursued spiritual practices diligently, meditation after meditation, ritual after ritual, yet still feel that impenetrable wall between yourself and true connection with others. The frustration of reaching for something that constantly eludes your grasp has become all too familiar. I understand this struggle intimately. The purely spiritual approach has its limitations, focusing on transcendence while often neglecting the powerful undercurrents of the unconscious mind that determine our connections. This is where traditional spiritual teachings have failed you, not by intention, but by incomplete understanding of the human psyche. What I am about to share with you integrates the revolutionary insights of psychoanalysis with your spiritual practice, revealing how the collision of two conscious minds creates a third space, an intersubjective realm where true spiritual connection becomes possible. Imagine finally understanding why certain people trigger profound spiritual experiences while others leave you feeling depleted. Envision having the ability to navigate these collisions with intention rather than being tossed about by unconscious forces you cannot name. This knowledge has remained hidden, not because it is meant to be secret, but because it requires the courage to look beyond the veil of consciousness into the shadows where the most powerful connections are formed. As the founder of psychoanalysis, I have dedicated my life to understanding these shadows, and today, I will guide you through this territory with the precision that only deep analytical insight can provide. Before we delve deeper into this fascinating subject, I want to ask you a simple question. Have you ever experienced a moment of profound connection with another person that seemed to transcend normal consciousness? A moment where time stood still, and you felt a merging of minds that defied logical explanation? If you have, you already have first-hand experience of what happens in the collision of conscious minds. This phenomenon is not merely psychological curiosity but the foundation of our most meaningful spiritual connections. Take a moment to recall that experience now, feel it in your body, remember the sensations that accompanied it. That memory will serve as our entry point into understanding the mechanics of conscious collision. When two conscious minds collide, what occurs is far more complex than simple communication or empathy. From an analytical perspective, we must first understand that what we call consciousness is merely the tip of a vast iceberg floating in the sea of the unconscious. The conscious mind, that rational, logical part of ourselves that we identify with, represents only a fraction of our mental processes. Beneath it lies the preconscious, those memories and thoughts that are not currently in awareness but can be readily accessed, and deeper still, the unconscious, that reservoir of repressed desires, forgotten experiences, and primitive instincts that shape our behavior in ways we rarely recognize. When you encounter another person, it is not merely two conscious minds meeting, but two complete psychic structures, each with their conscious and unconscious dimensions. The collision occurs at multiple levels simultaneously. At the conscious level, there is the exchange of words, ideas, and explicit intentions. This is what most people focus on and what traditional communication theories address. However, far more significant is what happens at the unconscious level. Here, the repressed material, the unacknowledged desires, the forgotten traumas, and the primitive drives of each person interact in a dance of projection and introjection. Your unconscious recognizes aspects of the other person's psyche that resonate with your own repressed material. This recognition occurs instantaneously, beyond the reach of conscious awareness, creating that sense of inexplicable familiarity or aversion that seems to precede rational assessment. The spiritual experiences many seek through meditation or prayer are often manifestations of this unconscious recognition, misattributed to external spiritual forces rather than understood as the complex interplay of unconscious minds. I want to pause here for a moment and create a more personal connection with you. Have you ever felt truly heard and understood? Not just your words being acknowledged, but the deepest parts of yourself being recognized? That experience of being seen beyond the mask we present to the world is increasingly rare in our fragmented society. I want you to know that I see you in your struggle to connect, and you are yearning for something deeper than the superficial interactions that fill most days. If this resonates with you, if you've experienced that hunger for authentic connection, please share your experience in the comments below. Something as simple as this speaks to my journey because can be the beginning of a profound exploration. By sharing, you not only deepen your own understanding through articulation, but you contribute to a community of seekers who can support each other. The act of expressing these experiences has a therapeutic effect, bringing unconscious material closer to consciousness where it can be integrated. And now, let us continue our exploration of what happens when conscious minds collide. The most fascinating aspect of this collision is what I call the transference phenomenon. In my clinical work, I observed how patients would unconsciously transfer feelings, attitudes, and expectations from significant figures in their past, particularly parental figures, onto the analyst. This is not merely a quirk of the therapeutic relationship but a fundamental aspect of all human interactions. When you meet someone new, you are never truly meeting them as a blank slate. Instead, you are encountering them through the lens of your past relationships, projecting onto them qualities, intentions, and emotions that may have little to do with their actual being. Similarly, they are projecting their unconscious material onto you. This mutual projection creates a complex intersubjective field that transcends the individual consciousness of either participant. It is within this field that the most profound spiritual connections occur. Consider the experience of falling in love. The overwhelming sense of recognition, of having known this person before, the feeling that they complete you in some essential way, these are all manifestations of powerful projections. You are not seeing the other person in their totality but recognizing in them aspects of your own unconscious material that seeks integration. This is why romantic relationships have such spiritual potency and why they can be vehicles for profound psychological growth when understood correctly. The same mechanism operates in spiritual teacher-student relationships, and deep friendships, and even in antagonistic relationships that trigger intense emotional reactions. These are all collisions of conscious minds that activate unconscious material, creating opportunities for integration and growth. Let us examine how these collisions manifest in childhood and how they shape our spiritual capacity later in life. The infant's mind, lacking the defensive structures and repressive mechanisms of the adult, is extraordinarily open to psychic collision. The primary caregiver, usually the mother, serves as the infant's first experience of another conscious mind. Through the processes of mirroring and attunement, the caregiver's conscious and unconscious responses shape the developing psyche of the child. When this attunement is consistent and loving, the child develops a sense of security and trust that forms the foundation for healthy relationships throughout life. However, when this attunement is disrupted, when the caregiver's unconscious conflicts intrude on the relationship, the child internalizes these disruptions as psychic wounds. For example, a mother who is unconsciously ambivalent about her role as a caregiver may alternate between excessive attention and emotional withdrawal. The infant, unable to comprehend this inconsistency, internalizes it as a sense of fundamental unpredictability in relationships. This early trauma becomes encoded in the child's developing neural pathways, creating what I would call a psychic score that influences all future encounters with other conscious minds. As this child grows into adulthood, these early experiences of conscious collision create specific patterns in their spiritual life. If their early collisions were characterized by inconsistency and unpredictability, they may develop a spiritual practice characterized by intense periods of devotion followed by disillusionment and withdrawal. They may be drawn to spiritual teachers who recreate the ambivalent attachment pattern of their childhood, unconsciously seeking to master the original trauma through repetition. Alternatively, they may avoid deep spiritual commitments altogether, maintaining a superficial engagement that protects them from the vulnerability of authentic connection. The symptoms of such early trauma in the spiritual seeker are varied but recognizable to the trained eye. There may be an excessive idealization of spiritual figures followed by bitter disappointment when they inevitably fail to meet impossible expectations. There may be a compulsive seeking of new spiritual experiences without integration of previous insights. There may be a pattern of spiritual bypassing, using spiritual practice to avoid confronting psychological wounds rather than as a means of healing them. All these symptoms reflect the unresolved collisions of early consciousness, playing out in the spiritual domain where the stakes of connection and meaning are highest. These patterns connect directly to my concept of repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate early traumatic situations in an attempt to gain mastery over them. In the spiritual context, seekers often unconsciously choose teachers, practices, or communities that recreate the dynamics of their early wounding. The person who experienced emotional neglect may be drawn to an aloof, intellectually demanding spiritual tradition that recreates the emotional deprivation of childhood. The individual who experienced intrusive parenting may be attracted to all-encompassing spiritual communities that regulate every aspect of life. These choices are not conscious but driven by the unconscious need to resolve early traumas through repetition. Modern research in attachment theory has validated these observations, demonstrating how early attachment patterns create templates for later relationships, including those in the spiritual domain. Studies of religious conversion experiences often reveal striking parallels between the convert's relationship with their new deity or teacher and their earliest attachment relationships, confirming what psychoanalysis discovered through clinical observation. Another crucial concept for understanding conscious collision is projection. The unconscious mind constantly projects its own contents onto the external world, particularly onto other people. This projection serves multiple purposes. It externalizes internal conflicts, making them seemingly more manageable. It protects the ego from acknowledging unacceptable impulses by attributing them to others, and it creates a bridge between the internal psychic reality and the external world. In spiritual contexts, projection operates with particular intensity. The divine beings, enlightened teachers, or demonic forces that populate spiritual narratives are often repositories for massive projections of unconscious material. When a devotee experiences the overwhelming love of a deity, they are often experiencing a projection of their own capacity for love, disowned and projected outward where it appears as coming from beyond. Similarly, the experience of evil or negative forces in spiritual practice frequently represents projected aspects of the shadow self, those disowned parts of the psyche that are too threatening to acknowledge as one's own. The collision of conscious minds and spiritual communities intensifies these projections through the phenomenon of group psychology, where individual projections are amplified and reinforced by collective belief. This explains the extraordinary emotional intensity of religious gatherings, where the collision of multiple conscious minds, all engaged in similar projections, creates experiences that seem to transcend ordinary consciousness. The phenomenon of transference, which I first observed in the analytical setting, is particularly relevant to understanding conscious collision in spiritual contexts. In transference, the patient unconsciously transfers feelings, attitudes, and expectations from significant figures in their past onto the analyst. This same process occurs with spiritual teachers, gurus, priests, or any figure invested with spiritual authority. The spiritual seeker unconsciously transfers parental imagos onto these figures, recreating the earliest experiences of dependency, protection, and authority. When two conscious minds collide in this context, the resulting experience can be one of extraordinary power. The seeker experiences the teacher not simply as another human being but as a complex amalgam of projected parental qualities, divine attributes, and their own disowned spiritual potential. This explains the extraordinary emotional reactions that spiritual teachers can evoke, from ecstatic devotion to bitter disillusionment. It also explains why spiritual communities so often become theaters for the playing out of unresolved family dynamics, with all the love, conflict, jealousy, and competition that entails. Countertransference, the analyst's unconscious reaction to the patient's transference, has its parallel in spiritual relationships as well. The spiritual teacher, being human despite any claims to transcendence, brings their own unconscious material to the collision of minds. They may be drawn to particular students because of unconscious resonances, may respond to devotion with unconscious gratification of narcissistic needs, or may enact their own unresolved conflicts through their teaching role. This mutual dance of transference and countertransference creates a complex intersubjective field that can either facilitate profound spiritual growth or recreate traumatic patterns, depending on the awareness and integration of both participants. The collision of conscious minds thus always occurs within this transferential matrix, colored by the unconscious material that each person brings to the encounter. Having explored the dynamics of conscious collision, let us now turn to the question of how this understanding can facilitate spiritual growth and healing. The first principle of psychoanalytic healing is that bringing unconscious material into consciousness reduces its disruptive power. The same principle applies to conscious collisions. By becoming aware of the projections, transferences, and unconscious patterns that shape our spiritual connections, we gain the freedom to engage with others more authentically. This does not mean eliminating the unconscious dimension of connection, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but rather developing what I call evenly suspended attention, the capacity to observe our own reactions without being entirely captured by them. In practical terms, this means approaching spiritual relationships with a dual awareness, immersing ourselves in the experience while simultaneously maintaining an observing stance that notes our reactions without judgment. This dual consciousness allows us to use the collision of minds as a mirror for self-knowledge rather than merely reenacting unconscious patterns. The techniques of free association, which I developed for the analytical setting, have their parallel in spiritual practice as well. By allowing thoughts, feelings, and sensations to arise without censorship or direction, we create space for unconscious material to emerge into awareness. In the context of conscious collision, this means cultivating an attitude of openness to whatever arises in the presence of another, neither suppressing uncomfortable reactions nor indulging them uncritically. Many contemplative traditions have developed practices that serve a similar function, from certain forms of meditation to contemplative dialogue, where the focus is not on achieving a particular state but on observing with equanimity whatever emerges in consciousness. These practices, when understood through a psychoanalytic lens, can be seen as methods for making conscious the unconscious dimensions of spiritual connection. There are striking parallels between psychoanalytic techniques and ancient spiritual practices that suggest a universal recognition of these dynamics across cultures and times. The emphasis on the relationship between teacher and student in many spiritual traditions acknowledges implicitly the transformative potential of conscious collision. The guru-disciple relationship in Hindu traditions, the master-apprentice relationship in Zen Buddhism, the spiritual direction relationship in Christian mysticism, all create controlled environments for the collision of conscious minds, where the resulting psychological material can be worked with deliberately. These traditions developed sophisticated understandings of transference and projection long before these concepts were articulated in psychological language. For example, the Tibetan practice of guru yoga explicitly uses the projection of divine qualities onto the teacher as a means of recognizing those same qualities within oneself, a psychological mechanism that precisely parallels the resolution of transference in analysis. What I am offering is not a replacement for spiritual practice but an integration that honors both the depths of the unconscious and the heights of spiritual aspiration. By understanding the psychological mechanisms at work when conscious minds collide, we can engage more intentionally with spiritual connections, neither dismissing extraordinary experiences as mere projection nor accepting them uncritically as coming from beyond the psyche. This integrated approach recognizes that the boundary between psychological and spiritual experience is not fixed but fluid, that the same phenomena can be approached from either perspective with valuable insights. The revolutionary potential of this integration lies in its capacity to heal the false dichotomy between spiritual transcendence and psychological integration, recognizing them as complementary aspects of human development. The ultimate promise of this approach is not just individual healing but a transformation of how we understand intersubjectivity itself. When we recognize that every encounter between conscious minds creates a third space, neither entirely within one person nor the other but in the field between them, we open to a more fluid, relational understanding of consciousness. This intersubjective space is where the most profound spiritual experiences occur, not as the property of an individual consciousness but as emergent phenomena arising from connection itself. This understanding has profound implications for spiritual communities, suggesting that the quality of conscious collision within a community may be more important than any particular belief or practice in determining its transformative potential. It suggests a shift from seeing spiritual development as an individual achievement to recognizing it as something that emerges through relationship, through the deliberate and conscious collision of minds engaged in mutual exploration. To conclude our exploration of what happens when conscious minds collide, let me summarize the key insights that can transform your spiritual journey. First, recognize that every significant spiritual connection involves both conscious and unconscious dimensions, with the latter often being more determinative than the former. Second, understand that your reactions to spiritual teachers, texts, and communities are shaped by early experiences of conscious collision, particularly with parental figures, creating transference patterns that can either facilitate growth or reenact trauma. Third, acknowledge the role of projection in spiritual experience, neither dismissing extraordinary experiences as mere projection nor failing to recognize your own unconscious material when it appears in external form. Fourth, develop the capacity for dual consciousness, fully immersing yourself in spiritual connection while maintaining and observing awareness that can recognize unconscious patterns as they emerge. Fifth, integrate psychological and spiritual approaches, using each to illuminate the blind spots of the other rather than treating them as separate or opposed domains. I know this journey of integration is not an easy one. It requires courage to look unflinchingly at your own unconscious patterns, to recognize how they shape your spiritual seeking, and to take responsibility for your projections rather than locating all spiritual authority outside yourself. This path asks more of you than passive consumption of spiritual teachings or unquestioning devotion to external authority. It demands active engagement with your own psyche, a willingness to encounter the shadow aspects that most spiritual approaches prefer to bypass or suppress. But this difficulty is precisely what makes the journey worthwhile. By integrating the unconscious dimensions of spiritual connection, you develop a more authentic, grounded spirituality that can withstand the inevitable disillusionments and challenges of the path. You move from spiritual seeking that reenacts unconscious patterns to spiritual practice that transforms them. Throughout this journey, remember that you are not alone. We are all navigating the complex terrain of conscious collision, all seeking to understand the mysterious alchemy that occurs when minds meet in authentic connection. By subscribing to this channel, you join a community of fellow travelers committed to this integration of depth psychology and spiritual wisdom. Each video offers new insights into this territory, practical guidance for working with your own unconscious patterns, and perspectives that bridge the artificial divide between psychological and spiritual approaches. By giving this video a like, you help extend this message to others who may be struggling with the same questions, feeling the same disconnect between their psychological needs and spiritual aspirations. The path of integration is not one that can be walked alone. It requires dialogue, community, and the conscious collision of minds committed to mutual growth. I invite you to join this community, to bring your questions and insights, your struggles and breakthroughs, to this shared exploration. As we continue this journey together, at a pace that honors the complexity of the psyche rather than rushing toward premature transcendence, we create a field of conscious collision with transformative potential. I offer these insights not as final answers but as an invitation to deeper questioning, trusting that as you integrate these perspectives into your own experience, you will discover truths that go beyond what any external authority, including myself, can provide. The true measure of this work is not how faithfully you follow my ideas, but how effectively they help you recognize and integrate the wisdom of your own unconscious mind, bringing it into creative dialogue with your spiritual aspirations. In this integration of depths and heights, shadows and light, lies the promise of a spirituality that embraces the full spectrum of human experience, excluding nothing, transforming everything.